Before we get into theories and timelines and what the FBI might be thinking, I want you to picture the place the way someone who lives there would. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just ordinary. The Catalina Foothills, just outside Tucson, is the kind of neighborhood where routines settle in quietly. Same cars pulling in at night, same early morning joggers, same landscapers showing up like clockwork. People notice things there, not because they're suspicious, but because everything feels consistent. And actually, before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. I always find it interesting where people are watching these from, especially with cases like this that start in one quiet corner and somehow end up pulling attention from all over the world. Anyway, this is one of the wealthiest zip codes in Arizona. Gated roads, wide streets, homes set back just enough to feel private without being isolated. It's not the kind of place where strangers pass through casually. There's no foot traffic, no nearby shops bringing in unfamiliar faces. If you don't live there, there's usually no reason for you to be there. So when something unusual happens, it doesn't just stand out, it lingers. On the night of January 31st, going into the early hours of February 1st, 2026, something happened inside one of those homes. An 84-year-old woman disappeared. Not from a parking lot, not from a hospital, not while traveling, but from inside her own house. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. And there's another detail that quietly pulled this case into the national spotlight. Her daughter is Savannah Guthrie. Most people know her face. They've seen her on morning television for years. But here, she's not a broadcaster. She's a daughter, waiting for answers that haven't come. Nancy's evening, at least on the surface, followed a normal pattern. She left home earlier that day for a family dinner, took an Uber, and was dropped back off at around 9:48 p.m. 2 minutes later. By 9:50, the garage door had closed behind her. That small detail matters. It tells us she made it home safely. No interruption, no visible issue, nothing out of place. And then the night stretches forward. Sometime between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. the house is quiet. No visitors reported. No activity that raised concern. And then at exactly 1:47 a.m. her doorbell camera disconnects. Just like that. No warning, no footage leading up to it. Just a sudden gap. I keep thinking about how that must have looked from the outside. A house that appears completely still. Lights off, no movement, nothing unusual. And yet, something had already started unfolding inside or just outside that front door. By morning, Nancy is gone. Blood is found on the front porch. And that detail, it's hard to move past it, because it removes any ambiguity. This wasn't someone wandering off. This wasn't confusion or disorientation. Something happened there at the threshold of her home, and it happened with enough force to leave evidence behind. Weeks go by, then more than a month. And here, where things take a turn that I don't think a lot of people expected. The FBI doesn't just stay involved, they return. Not in a broad, general way, but with focus. They start knocking on doors again in that same neighborhood, not asking vague questions like, "Did you see anything unusual?" but something much more specific. They start asking about a house nearby. A rental property. Now at first glance that might not seem like much. Every neighborhood has rentals. People move in, people move out. It's part of the normal rhythm of things. But in a place like Catalina Foothills, where familiarity is the baseline, a rental stands out a little differently. It introduces change. New faces, new cars, new routines. And if that property suddenly becomes vacant around the same time an abduction takes place just a short distance away, it stops being background detail. It becomes something you look at twice. Here, where it gets complicated, and honestly, a little frustrating. There isn't a single, clear timeline for that house. Some reporting suggests the renters moved out before Nancy disappeared. Other accounts say they left immediately after. Those are two very different scenarios. If they left before, then you're looking at a house that sat empty during the days or weeks leading up to the abduction. No one inside. No one noticing if someone else came and went. Just a quiet, unused space in the middle of an otherwise watchful neighborhood. But if they left after, that's something else entirely. That suggests timing that's hard to ignore. A departure that lines up a little too neatly with the crime itself. And the FBI, from the way they're handling this, seems to understand exactly how important that distinction is. Because they're not treating it like a throwaway detail. They're asking pointed questions about who lived there when they left, what was normal for that house, what wasn't. The kind of questions that suggest they're trying to reconstruct not just what happened that night, but what the neighborhood looked like in the weeks before it. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that shift, because early on the focus was entirely on Nancy's home, the entry point, the footage, the timeline. Now the lens widens just enough to include a second location. Not far away, not disconnected, just close enough to matter. And that usually means one thing. Something new came in. A tip, maybe. A memory someone didn't think was important at the time. Something small that didn't make sense until later. Investigations like this don't circle back unless there's a reason. Something shook loose. And now they're retracing steps, not because they're starting over, but because they're following a thread that leads straight back to that street, that block, that one particular house. So the question becomes, what could that house offer someone? What could it give a person who needed to be nearby, without being noticed? We'll get into that next, because it changes how you look at everything that happened here. But if you're following this case closely, go ahead and like and subscribe, not as a routine ask, but because stories like this don't unfold all at once. They come together in pieces, and right now, this feels like one of those moments where a new piece just landed. Here's the thing. When someone who's spent years planning high-risk operations starts describing a case like this, you pay attention a little differently. Not because they're always right, but because they tend to see structure where the rest of us just see fragments. That's where Bob Krieger comes in. He's not approaching this as a commentator. He worked in the same county, moved through the same types of neighborhoods, dealt with the same logistical realities that exist in a place like Catalina Foothills. So when he talks about what might have been happening behind the scenes here, it doesn't come across as a theory. It sounds more like pattern recognition. In his assessment, this wasn't just a planned act. It was supported by something, infrastructure. And that's a word we don't usually associate with crimes like this, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you sit with it. Because if you think about it, really think about it, operations that require timing, observation, and precision don't just happen out in the open. They need a base, somewhere to prepare, to observe, to exist without raising questions. Krieger used a very specific phrase, a staging location. And I remember pausing on that because it shifts the focus. It suggests that the crime scene, the house, the porch, the moment Nancy disappeared wasn't the whole picture. It was just the endpoint of something that had been building. A staging location is where that buildup happens. Now bring that back to the rental property the FBI is asking about. A place like that offers something subtle but powerful, legitimacy. You're not just a stranger in the area, you belong there, at least on paper. You have a reason to be parked on that street late at night. You have a reason to walk around, to come and go, to exist within the rhythm of the neighborhood without interrupting it. And that's different from trying to stay hidden. It's more like blending in. Krieger made an important distinction here. He talked about a cover story, not an alibi. And those aren't interchangeable. An alibi explains where you were after something happens. A cover story explains why you're there before anything happens at all. So if someone sees you sitting in your car at midnight, there's no suspicion. You live nearby. If you're walking past the same house more than once, it doesn't stand out. You're just heading back home. It closes the loop before anyone even thinks to question it. And then there's the surveillance angle. This is where it gets a little harder to ignore the implications, because we're not just talking about someone casually watching from a distance. Krieg here raised the possibility of equipment, something placed inside a structure, out of sight, operating over time. Not a person at a window, but a system. A camera maybe, a sensor, something that could monitor activity continuously without requiring anyone to physically be there. Something that could collect information quietly, day after day, while the property itself appears empty. I keep circling back to that idea, because it changes how you think about proximity. From about 50 feet away, which is a reasonable estimate for the spacing between homes in that area, you can learn a lot. You don't need to step onto someone's property to understand their routine. You just need time and a clear line of sight. You can track when lights go on and off. You notice patterns, when someone leaves in the morning, when they return at night. You see which entrance they use more often, whether the garage opens and closes quickly or lingers. You start to recognize gaps. And once you see the gaps, you start to understand where someone is most vulnerable. Nancy's timeline, when you lay it out, feels almost structured in hindsight. She returns home at 9:48 p.m. By 9:50, the garage is closed. Then there's a stretch of hours, quiet, predictable, uninterrupted, before anything happens. If someone had been observing her home over a period of time, they would have known that window existed. They would have known she was alone. And more importantly, they would have known when the rest of the neighborhood goes quiet, when fewer cars pass through, when fewer lights are on, when the chance of someone noticing something unusual drops significantly. That's not instinct, that's information gathered over time. And it's not just one expert saying this. That's what makes this harder to dismiss. Different voices, different backgrounds, all pointing in the same direction. Former investigators, forensic specialists, even people with military experience, they're all describing the same underlying structure. Surveillance first, planning second, execution last. There's also the detail about January 11th. Some believe the suspect may have approached the house weeks before the abduction, what's often described as a trial run. Not to act, but to test, to see how visible they were, to understand how the house responded, maybe even to check how long they could stay in that space without drawing attention. If that's true, then February 1st wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of something that had already been rehearsed. And that changes how you interpret everything else. Even the technical issues reported that night start to look different. The missing camera footage, the connectivity disruptions, the doorbell camera going offline at 1:47 a.m. Individually, those could be explained away. Systems fail, Wi-Fi drops, things happen. But when you place them alongside the idea of prolonged observation, they start to feel less like coincidences and more like steps. Because if someone had been watching long enough, they wouldn't just know when to act. They'd know what needed to be addressed before they did. Which cameras were connected, which ones weren't, which systems relied on internet access and which stored footage locally. That's not something you figure out in a single night. That comes from being nearby, from paying attention, from having the time and the reason to study those details without interruption. And that brings us back to the house again. If it was vacant, even temporarily, it becomes more than just a location. It becomes an opportunity, a place where someone could operate without being seen, a place where observation could happen without raising suspicion. If it wasn't vacant, if someone was still connected to it, then the questions shift. But either way, it stays relevant. Because in a case where everything points to planning, you can't ignore the possibility that there was a place where that planning unfolded. So now the question isn't just what happened at Nancy's home. It's what might have been happening just a few doors down, in a house that, on the surface, looked like nothing at all. There's one part of this case that keeps pulling everything back into focus, and it's easy to overlook because it doesn't sound dramatic at first. Construction. Not the kind of detail that headlines grab onto, but the FBI has been asking about it in a very specific way. Not companies, not general activity, names, individual workers, every person who had access to those properties in the weeks leading up to February 1st. And I keep thinking, why go that granular unless you believe access itself is the key? Because here's the thing, construction workers and renters share something important in a neighborhood like Catalina Foothills. They belong there, or at least they appear to. A truck pulling up early in the morning doesn't raise questions. Someone walking between properties doesn't stand out. It blends into the normal rhythm of the place. And in a neighborhood where strangers are usually obvious, blending in is everything. So if someone needed a reason to be there repeatedly, to observe, to learn patterns, to move through the area without drawing attention, those are two of the cleanest ways to do it. You're not hiding. You're just present. And presence over time turns into familiarity, not with people necessarily, but with the environment, with routines, with systems. Now layer that onto everything else we've talked about. A nearby rental property that may have been empty or may have been vacated at a very specific moment. Weeks of potential surveillance. A timeline that suggests careful observation rather than chance. Connectivity issues the night Nancy disappeared. Missing footage across multiple homes. Individually, each of those details can sit on their own. You can explain them away, one by one. Together, they don't sit as comfortably. Then there's the contradiction, the one that hasn't been resolved, at least not publicly. Did the renters leave before Nancy disappeared or right after? Because depending on which version is true, the entire interpretation shifts. If they left before, then you're looking at a property that sat empty during a critical window. No one inside. No one noticing if someone else was coming and going. No one to question a light turning on or a car pulling in late at night. That's not just an empty house. That's a blind spot. But if they left immediately after, then it becomes something else entirely. A departure that aligns just a little too closely with the timing of the abduction. Not a routine move, but something that feels more abrupt, cleaner, like a presence that was there and then suddenly was. And I don't think the FBI is choosing between those two possibilities yet. From the way they're asking questions, it feels like they're holding both in place, trying to see which one holds up under pressure. There's also something else that lingers in the background of all this. A neighbor, someone who had lived in that area for years, mentioned seeing a man in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. He didn't fit. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not dressed like someone hiking, not moving like someone who belonged in that environment, just there, and then gone. I'm still trying to decide how much weight to give that. Because on one hand, neighborhoods always have small moments like that, things that feel unusual at the time but don't lead anywhere. But on the other hand, this is exactly the kind of detail that tends to matter later, when everything else starts to line up around it. Especially if someone was operating nearby, especially if they had a reason to be there. And then there's the silence. The FBI hasn't confirmed what they've found, or haven't found, inside that rental property. They haven't said whether it's been searched in a formal sense. They haven't closed that thread publicly. And in a case where certain details have been shared, footage, evidence, timelines, that silence doesn't feel accidental. It feels intentional. Like they're holding something back, because it connects to something else they're still working through. I keep coming back to that idea of a second pass. Investigators returning to the same neighborhood, asking sharper questions, focusing on narrower details. That doesn't happen just to be thorough. It happens because something new entered the picture. A tip, a memory, a name. Something shook loose. And now they're retracing, not to go backward, but to connect what they already have with something they didn't see clearly the first time. When you step back and look at the full picture as it stands now, it's hard not to see the outline of something deliberate, a neighborhood that was observed, routines that were learned, systems that may have been understood well enough to interfere with. And somewhere within that, a place, whether it was that rental or something connected to it, that allowed all of that to happen without being noticed in real time. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. That's the part that cuts through everything else. The analysis, the theories, the operational language, it all leads back to that one fact. An 84-year-old woman taken from her home, and weeks later, there's still no clear answer as to where she is or who took her. So the question I keep circling back to isn't just who did this. It's how long they were there before anyone realized they were watching. If you've been following this case, go ahead and like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because stories like this don't resolve all at once. They unfold in layers, and it feels like we're right in the middle of one shifting now. And maybe the better question, the one that's harder to answer, is this. If someone really was operating that close, in plain sight, how many times did they pass through that street before they stopped being noticed at all?